Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We're picking up where we left off from our previous conversation about the monarchy in Israel. We've already been familiarized with the monarchy. We're talking there about the kings that reigned over Israel during their time as a nation. And just to backtrack a little bit so we understand where we came from and how we've gotten to this point in our third discussion about Israel's monarchy, it all started back with King Saul. And you recall that prior to King Saul being anointed as king and established in that role, you had judges that ruled over the nation. And I say ruled in a loose sense, not that they themselves were kings or that they had any sort of authority other than what God empowered them to have, but that is to say that they were the people that the Israelites looked to. They were the people who were viewed as the leaders in that sense. They were the ones who were the deliverers from their enemies. They were commanders in the army. On and on we could go with the judges, but it was never a consolidated situation. It was never organized. It was never structured. By the time you get to Saul, you're beginning to see that structure form where you have a kingdom in place in Israel. Things are starting to improve a little bit, although we understand, of course, from our conversation about Saul, things did not go well with him. But that was not an indictment per se of the kingdom itself, but rather of Saul as a person. Because we see later on, after Saul's departure from the kingship, as it were, we have David taking the throne. And David is a much better king than Saul was. Not that David didn't make bad decisions. He was a human being after all. But it's because David was a man after God's own heart that he was able to be prosperous in his service as king. And he realized the responsibility that was laid upon his shoulders, and he understood that that responsibility meant something. And he was willing to do what it took to be successful in that role with God's blessings, because he realized just how serious it was. It was that seriousness, like we talked about last week, that led David to prepare his son Solomon to rule over Israel, because David, of all people, understood the burden of leadership. And he wanted to make sure that his son that would come after him to reign would be set up for success. He did not want Solomon to have to deal with a bunch of problems and troubles like David had to deal with. So he wanted to ensure that Solomon was ready to go, that he would have a running start, that he could be successful from the outset. So we found at the end of 1 Chronicles, talking about David and what he says there about Solomon, about the temple of the Lord, he makes it as plain as he possibly can that Solomon will be the king, and not only that, but that Solomon has a charge and a mandate to build the temple of the Lord, and he's even laid up a bunch of materials for him to begin that process of building. So Solomon doesn't have to scramble around trying to find the materials and the builders and all these different things. Much of that was already set before him by his father David, and it's simply for him to carry out the work. So Solomon is set up for success here. He has everything that he needs to be prosperous in the Lord's service as the king over Israel. Now, that does not mean that early on he did not come across conflict, because he most certainly did. We have a note here that Solomon ran into conflict with his brother Adonijah. In the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings, we have this narration that Adonijah had tried to usurp the throne from Solomon. Again, it was clear as day from David's mouth that Solomon would be the one to reign. But Adonijah presumed that he could reign in his place, that he could take the throne, and he had some supporters who were trying to bolster him to that end, and it did not go well for him nor for those who supported him, because it's in the end Solomon who is established and accepted as Israel's king, not Adonijah. And there's much more detail we could go into than that, but we're looking at this in an overview fashion. But who was Solomon as a person? So we understand that he was set up for success. We understand that it was David's intention that he be king, and by extension, we understand that was the Lord's intention for Solomon to be king. But who was he as a person? That's really an important question to consider about who he was, because he's more than just someone dwelling in David's shadow. So who is he as a person? Well, 1 Kings chapter 3 in the first few verses really gives us a good indicator of who he is. Here Solomon is, in a situation where God comes to him in a dream. And God simply puts this before him and says, "Ask, and I will give it to you." So God has issued this open-ended request of Solomon for him to ask of the Lord whatever he desires. He could have asked for any number of things. Maybe he could have asked for riches. Maybe he could have asked for power and authority in the sight of the people. Maybe he could have asked for a long life. Any number of things Solomon could have asked for. The world was his oyster as it was. God had directly said, just ask for it and I'll give it to you. No further requirements attached to it, no strings attached, just ask for it and it'll be given to you. Well, rather than ask for any of those things, Solomon asks for wisdom. And it's interesting that Solomon does that, because he notes in 1 Kings chapter 3 that he felt like he was a little child, that he didn't know whether to come or to go. He didn't know how to go about ruling over God's people. He felt like he needed help in that area to be effective as king, and that really shows us where Solomon's heart was at the start of his reign. He's not someone who's in this for himself. Now, true enough, we've already established that it was David's intention to make Solomon king, so this is something being put upon him, but it's not as though Solomon looked at it that way. He did not look at this from the standpoint of, I'm king and I can do whatever I please, and especially because my father was David, and so now you really have to do what I tell you, and you really have to submit to me. That's not the way Solomon operated at the early part of his reign. Instead, he asked for wisdom to know how to lead God's people. He has the humility to understand that he did not have the knowledge nor the skills needed to be a leader of God's people, that he was completely unprepared. And that is to say that God then recognized Solomon's request, he honored it, and it pleased him well. Let's take a look at that for just a moment here in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 10 through 14. Again, that's 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 10 through 14. And here is what the testimony says of how the Lord felt about Solomon's request for wisdom rather than anything else that he might have asked for at that moment. The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. It's incredible to think about what God says in those verses that we just read, because God is saying very plainly he was pleased by Solomon's request. He was grateful in a sense that Solomon had requested these things instead of anything else that he could have asked for. And God then says something incredible at that moment, that because Solomon had not asked for those things that he otherwise could have, and instead asked for wisdom, God says, I'm going to bless you in abundance. I'm going to give you the things you didn't ask for. I'm going to bestow upon you so many good things because you have asked this thing of me. And what a blessing that was for Solomon to hear this as a young king who's getting his start, who's trying to get his bearings around what it even looks like to serve as king. He really needed that. And so God has now established Solomon with the thing that he needed to be successful as a king over God's people. And he's going to exercise that to great effect throughout his reign, at least for the early and mid parts of it. We're going to find out something is going to enter the picture a little bit later. But for right now, at least, things are looking good. Things continue to look good. We see that Solomon's prosperity continues as he begins constructing the temple. Once again, that was something that David insisted that Solomon take up and continue after his demise, that he ensured that this temple is built. And it was a perfect time for this to be done. It's interesting that Solomon's name actually refers to peace, because Israel itself was in a time of complete peace and safety. That's what 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us in plain detail, that people were dwelling in safety. They didn't fear their enemies. They really didn't have a lot of enemies at that point in time. Things were going exceedingly well for them. And so that enables them, under the reign of Solomon, to begin the construction of that temple and to see it through to the end. And that's precisely what they do. Now, the construction of the temple had multiple parts to it, and it took them quite a while to do it. Over a decade had to be taken for them to go ahead and get this completed. They might have been able to do it quicker, but they wanted to make sure they took their time and had everything in place that was needed to make it as beautiful as possible. Because you have the temple itself that had to be built, which was done fairly quickly. Then you have all the associated structures for the temple, things like the courtyard and some of the other buildings for storage and so forth. And then you have the temple furnishings. These are the things they actually use in the service of the temple in order for them to actually fulfill their duties there like they had in the tabernacle. And so they get all these things built. Solomon oversees that process, and he ensures it comes to completion. He already had a lot of the resources, as we've already mentioned, but now he's bringing them all together and getting them all taken care of, so that way this temple is glorious, and he's going to be able to dedicate this to the Lord's service. But let's not forget something, that it was God's gracious blessings that enabled this to happen in the first place. It was God's blessings that enabled David to have this ability to have these resources stored up, and it was God's blessings upon Solomon to allow this to be built in the first place, to give them a situation and circumstance where this was even possible. So we're seeing Solomon's prosperity in the building of the temple, yes, but let's not lose sight of the fact that it is God giving Solomon this prosperity not the other way around. But continuing on from that prosperity in building the temple, things continue on that same trajectory with Solomon prospering during his reign. We find in 1 Kings chapter 8 a lengthy prayer that Solomon offers to God at the dedication of the temple. And in that prayer, we see Solomon expressing such beautiful thoughts. He expresses the reality of how God does not dwell in a temple made with hands, but they have built this to his glory and to his honor, and for his people to have a place to go to serve him and to do so well. To really be a people called after his name, in other words. To have a place they can look to and understand that God dwells among them. That's what the tabernacle represented in days past. That's what the temple represents now. And Solomon mentions these details, and he talks about how God should hear the prayers of those who offer prayer in this place and look to him for strength and for guidance, recognizing in their history their failures, but also recognizing in the future some of the problems they're going to experience. It's a very honest and open prayer, but it's a wonderful dedication at the time of the temple being opened, as we see there in 1 Kings chapter 8. In 1 Kings chapter 9, we see even more prosperity. So we see the temple as a symbol of that prosperity, but there's even more things that go along with that. In 1 Kings chapter 9, in verses 15 through 19, Solomon builds up a bunch of cities. He builds many, many places because of his vast wealth. He builds fortified cities and places to keep his horses and all these different things because he had so much wealth it was just flowing out of his ears. He is as wealthy as a man can be, and so he's building all these great cities. We find in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 23, in fact, that he was so prosperous that he surpassed all the kings of the earth that were at that time, to the extent that Solomon was so wealthy and so powerful that everyone else was paling in comparison to him. Now that is true power. That is true prosperity. But once again, where did that prosperity and that success come from? Was it Solomon's own ability to bring this to pass? Certainly not. Solomon himself already recognized back in chapter 3 that he couldn't do it himself. It was all because of God's blessings then that this was possible. It was because of God giving him these glorious gifts that he was able to enjoy all these blessings, and for Israel to share in those blessings for that matter. Because all that we're talking about didn't just apply to Solomon, it applied to the entire nation. They all benefited from this. And God was using Solomon to be a conduit of blessing for his people. And it was wonderful while it lasted. It was great to see that God's king, Solomon, was doing what he ought to have been doing, that he was doing well before God despite some things that take place during this time that we haven't really gone into much detail about. And yet, toward the end of his reign, as we're about to see, things did not continue on this prosperous trajectory. You would hope that Solomon learned from his father David, that he would be laying up for his son after him to reign, that he would be arranging things and orchestrating things in such a way that his descendants would have the best possible chance to keep the kingdom going and to ensure God's blessings upon them. But unfortunately, that is not what happens. We find then in 1 Kings chapter 11 that Solomon is going to take all the prosperity he accumulated throughout his life and his reign, and he is going to squander it. He's basically going to cast it out the window so he can have some pagan associations, specifically through these entanglements in these different marriages that he engages in. And through these pagan marriages that he engages in, he is going to be turned away from God and instead begin worshiping idols. Let's just take a quick look at 1 Kings chapter 11 and find out the problem here that takes place in Solomon's life toward the end of it, and how it was absolutely ruinous to his reign and to the future of the nation. So again, that's 1 Kings chapter 11, looking specifically at verses 1 through 4. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So we can clearly see the problem here in Solomon's life. Now there's some obvious issues here right off the bat where he has all of these hundreds of wives and these hundreds of concubines. Man, it's just incredible to think that Solomon thought this was a good decision to make. After all, he was gifted with all this wisdom, and yet he didn't understand this was not God's design for the family. This is completely at odds with God's design for the family, and yet Solomon went after them anyway. And note in verse 2 his motivation: Solomon clung to these in love. He really desired this companionship, apparently, and truly wanted to have these relationships. Even if he understood the danger of it, he just could not help himself to do this. And so in verse 4, the sad testimony is this: his heart was turned away from God after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. It is tragic that Solomon had such a strong start, had such a prosperous start, and such a prosperous reign, to now just waste it away through his own desires. It truly is sad that this situation unfolded the way that it did. And so we see, if we go down just a few verses, down into verses 9 through 13, that the Lord is displeased with Solomon. He cannot abide this any longer. He must take action, although he's not going to take action in the life of Solomon, but after Solomon has deceased from this life, he will take action against his descendants. The very thing that David had sought to avoid is the very thing that Solomon is going to allow because of his own conduct. So here's what verses 9 through 13 say to us. So the Lord became angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned away from the Lord his God, or from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and he commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days, for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem which I have chosen. Verse 9 is another tragic verse. The Lord became angry with Solomon. And although the Lord had given him so many commandments and had given him all that he needed to be successful, he just squandered it. He wasted it. It did not make any difference to him at all, at least not toward the end of his life. And so you see the consequences of verses 11 through 13. The kingdom is going to be divided. The last thing any king would want is for his kingdom to be divided, for his kingdom to be split in two, for there to be people who rise up against him. That's not what any king desires, and yet that's exactly what is going to happen. And you're going to see the seeds of that begin to be sown here in chapter 11 as different things begin to happen that really shake that safety and peace that we already talked about in chapter 4. That's not going to last. But it was Solomon's fault. So here you have a situation where Solomon was blessed beyond measure. He had every advantage in the world. He exercised those advantages, and for the most part he did well with what God had given to him and what he had been set up to accomplish. And yet we see just how tragic his ending was. The fact that he ends up in such a horrible situation, that he chose so poorly in his choices of marriages and going after those that would not lead him to the Lord but rather lead him to idols. This was not wise for him to do, and yet he did it anyway, because of his own desires and his passions that simply deceived him, and he allowed that to happen. We see then how easy it is to squander the Lord's blessings and turn them into something that he never intended. We see how easy it is to depart from the Lord's ways through our own passions and desires. And we see how easy it is for us to have such a strong start, to have even a strong middle part of our lives as we go about serving Jesus, but toward the end to maybe have some issues along the way, some temptations that come along that simply cause us to be hamstrung in our efforts to live for Jesus. Whatever the case may be, Solomon is a powerful lesson of how well it is when God blesses us and we work in conjunction with him to bring about his will, we can have great success before him. But Solomon is also a warning to us. A warning to not allow our passions and desires to interfere with what is right, to not allow those passions to cause our convictions to suddenly change, to not be so careless as to waste what God has given to us, but to embrace that prosperity, to embrace those blessings as God bestows them upon us according to his will, and to seek to use them the way that he intends. Had Solomon exercised the wisdom God had given him, things might have been different. But as we see here, he simply did not. So let's learn from Solomon's example. Let's understand that although he had a strong start and was, for the most part, a decent king, he definitely had some struggles that caused him to not be such a decent king toward the end of his life. And the consequences of his decisions are going to continue to reverberate throughout Israel's history from this point forward. And unfortunately, and inevitably, it's going to lead them into Babylonian captivity. But that'll be a subject for a future episode. For right now, we will conclude it there, having learned more about Solomon and his reign. And as always, I hope this has been a benefit to you, that you have learned something about him, and we'll continue this conversation next week. Thank you again.